The sword will never leave your house. Man, those are some chilling words. They were spoken by the prophet Nathan to King David right after his grave sins involving Bathsheba and Uriah. And sure, David confessed. He received God's forgiveness. But this haunting prophecy made one thing absolutely crystal clear: forgiveness doesn't just magically erase the consequences. At the time, honestly, no one could have possibly imagined how this would actually play out. Nobody knew that the sword destined to tear David's house apart wouldn't be held by some rival foreign king, but by his own family. Specifically, by the very son he loved most in the entire world. So, let's dive into exactly how this happened. Welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to unpack a profoundly tragic and seriously gripping narrative from the source material. Because, you see, we aren't just looking at a political rebellion today, we are exploring the total psychological collapse of a family. It's a fascinating, albeit heartbreaking look at what happens when sin is hidden, justice is delayed, and deep relational wounds are just left to the merciless hands of time. We're going to retrace the steps of how a king's most beloved son morphed into his kingdom's absolute greatest threat.
So, Part 1, a terrifying prophecy. Let's set the stage.
To really wrap our heads around this story, we have to look past the dazzling golden facade of the kingdom. Because at this point in history, King David was literally at the height of his power. Israel was winning its wars, Jerusalem was established as this majestic capital, and outwardly, peace was everywhere. But behind those heavy palace doors, the royal family was slowly rotting from the inside out. The inherent dynamic of David's household was an absolute powder kick. David had multiple wives and a lot of children, and while polygamy was something that happened, it strayed far from the original ideal, and it naturally bred distance, fierce jealousy, and just cutthroat competition for the throne among all these sons born to different mothers. You had Amnon, he was the eldest, the heir apparent, but then you also had Absalom, born to Maacah, a princess from a neighboring kingdom, which gave him this very distinct royal pedigree. And Absalom had a full sister, the beautiful Tamar.
That brings us to Part 2, injustice and dangerous silence.
We have to transition now from that underlying tension to the explosive, inciting incident that really set this entire tragedy into motion. This is the moment the kingdom's outward peace is completely shattered by a horrific internal crime. The heir, Amnon, developed a dark, obsessive lust for his half-sister Tamar. Aided by a really cunning cousin named Jonadab, Amnon devised a trap. He faked being sick, and when King David came to visit him, Amnon specifically requested that Tamar be sent to his room to bake bread for him. When she arrived, totally obedient and unsuspecting, he cleared the room. He cornered her and said, "Come, my sister, lie with me." Despite Tamar pleading with him, desperately telling him that such a thing is simply not done in Israel, Amnon forced himself on her. And then, in this truly devastating psychological twist, his lust instantly turned into an intense, irrational hatred. He had her thrown out, bolted the door behind her, and left Tamar to literally tear her royal robes and pour ashes on her head in absolute ruin.
So you have to ask yourself, how did King David react to this absolute atrocity? When the news reached the king, the text tells us he was furious. But here is the tragedy. He did absolutely nothing. Zero. He levied no punishment against Amnon. Why? Well, maybe because Amnon was the firstborn, or maybe because David's own past sins kind of paralyzed his moral authority. Whatever the actual reason, that massive vacuum of justice left a wound that began to violently fester in the shadows. Which leads us to Part 3, false reconciliation.
When a totally shattered Tamar arrived at her full brother Absalom's house, his reaction was eerily calm. He took her in, but he told her to stay quiet, reminding her that Amnon was their brother. But beneath that calm exterior, a volcano of pure, unadulterated rage was boiling. For 2 whole years, Absalom waited in grueling silence, just letting the bitterness consume him. Finally, he arranged a sheep-shearing festival, got Amnon incredibly drunk, and had his servants assassinate him. After that, Absalom fled into exile in Geshur for 3 long years. Eventually, David's general Joab manipulated the king into allowing Absalom back to Jerusalem. But get this. Even then, for 2 more years, David flat out refused to look at his son's face. If you add that up, that's 7 total years of silence, distance, and dangerously unaddressed anger.
Desperate and completely ignored for those final 2 years in Jerusalem, Absalom finally took some drastic measures. He summoned Joab twice to act as a mediator with the king, but Joab just ignored him. So Absalom did something almost childish, but hey, highly effective. He ordered his servants to set Joab's thriving barley field on fire. And it worked. An infuriated Joab finally came down to see him, and Absalom demanded to see the king, basically saying, "Look, I'd rather be executed if I'm guilty than continue living in this agonizing limbo."
So Joab takes the message to David, and the king finally summons Absalom. Absalom bows to the ground, and David kisses him. On the surface, right, it looks like this beautiful, picture-perfect reconciliation. But ask yourself, can a single kiss really erase 7 years of deep pain, murder, and total silence? The source material makes it abundantly clear that without true communication, without repentance, and actually processing the pain, this was merely a superficial band-aid over a fatal wound.
And that brings us to part 4, Rebellion for the Throne. Because that wound was never truly healed, Absalom's underlying bitterness morphed into something even more dangerous. It turned into a highly calculated thirst for total control and his father's throne. Absalom was no longer just a grieving brother. He was a political mastermind actively preparing for a coup. Here's the 4-step masterclass in political manipulation that he executed flawlessly. First, he got himself a chariot, horses, and 50 men to run before him, really projecting that royal authority. Then, he'd wake up early and stand right by the city gate. Step 1. He intercepted anyone coming to the king for justice. Step 2. He actively listened and validated their claims, telling them, hey, your case is good and right. Step 3. He planted a tiny seed of doubt, whispering that the king had no one there to hear them, wishing out loud that he were the judge. And step 4. When they bowed to him, he would reach out, grab them, and hug them. Over 4 long years, he methodically stole the hearts of the people of Israel.
After 4 years of laying all this deep psychological groundwork, Absalom struck. Under the guise of fulfilling a religious vow, he went to Hebron, and from there he sent secret messengers throughout all the tribes of Israel. At the sound of the trumpet, they were ordered to declare Absalom has become king in Hebron. It was a massive, perfectly orchestrated rebellion. The momentum was so overwhelming that King David, think about this, the legendary warrior who defeated Goliath, was literally forced to flee Jerusalem barefoot, his head covered, weeping as he climbed the Mount of Olives.
So Absalom takes Jerusalem, and he brings with him David's most brilliant, trusted advisor, Ahithophel, whose betrayal completely devastated David. In a war council, Ahithophel gives some ruthless but frankly perfect tactical advice. Take 12,000 men and strike David tonight while he's weary. If Absalom had listened right then and there, David would have died. But David had cleverly left a spy, Hushai, behind. Hushai brilliantly played to Absalom's massive ego. He advised him to wait, to gather this massive theatrical army from all of Israel and to lead them himself. The text tells us God thwarted Ahithophel's good advice specifically to bring ruin upon Absalom. Realizing the rebellion was now completely doomed by this delay, Ahithophel went home and tragically hung himself.
Now we reach the climax, Part 5, Destruction and Deep Lessons.
That delay gave David the critical time he desperately needed to organize his seasoned military leaders, Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, into 3 divisions. The stage was set for a truly heartbreaking civil war, father against son. Despite the ultimate betrayal, the massive public humiliation, and the very real threat to his life, just look at the heart of the father here. As the troops marched out, David stood by the gate and gave his 3 generals a strict, very public command. Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. His love for his son, however fractured and complicated it was still desperately fighting to save him. The 2 armies violently clashed in the thick, treacherous forest of Ephraim, and it was a total bloodbath. 20,000 men lost their lives that day. The source material notes this terrifying detail. The dense, hazardous forest itself actually devoured more men that day than the swords did. Then, in a moment of ultimate poetic irony, Absalom is riding his mule through the forest. His famously beautiful, thick hair, which was a huge symbol of his immense pride and vanity, gets caught in the thick branches of a massive oak tree. The mule keeps right on going, leaving the rebellious prince helplessly suspended there between heaven and earth, completely vulnerable.
A soldier spots him, but outright refuses to strike, honoring the king's direct command. But General Joab had no such sentimental reservations. Prioritizing the security of the entire kingdom over the emotional pleas of a grieving father, Joab took 3 javelins and ruthlessly thrust them right into Absalom's heart while he hung in the tree. ending the rebellion right then and there.
When the news finally reaches King David sitting by the city gates, the political victory meant absolutely nothing to him. He rushed up to the chamber over the gate, wailing in a grief so profound it literally echoes through history. "Oh, my son Absalom! My son Absalom! Would I had died instead of you!" The military victory was so deeply overshadowed by the king's crushing devastation that his victorious army actually sneaked back into the city in shame, acting as if they had lost the war.
As we look back at this entire tragedy, 4 stark takeaways really emerge from the text. First, the consequences of sin are incredibly long-lasting. David was forgiven, yes, but the ripples of his actions nearly destroyed his entire nation. Second, unresolved anger acts as a slow poison. Absalom's unaddressed rage over what happened to Amnon eventually consumed everything. Third, silence and distance are not solutions. Ignoring a massive problem doesn't fix it, it amplifies it. And finally, the prophecy spoken by Nathan at the very beginning proves that God's word, whether it's a blessing or a dire warning, is always fulfilled.
We're going to close today's analysis with a profound question to ponder. Could true, timely reconciliation have prevented this massive destruction? It really challenges us to look at our own lives, doesn't it? To examine the conversations we might be avoiding and the apologies we are withholding. True forgiveness requires facing the pain honestly, rather than just offering a superficial kiss and moving on. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into one of history's most compelling and tragic family dramas. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.